Do you actually know who's cooking your food in your favorite fast food restaurant? Do you know who's cleaning your room in the hotel when you're traveling? We should all and we can all be attentive of signals of exploitation.
Hello and welcome back to Collective Voices, the podcast from the International Trade Union Confederation. I am Stefania Cârlea, and in this first series, Back to Basics, we are exploring the fundamental workers' rights. In our previous episode, we explored collective bargaining, one of the most powerful tools workers have, a way to come to the table and start shaping the decisions that affect their lives. However, for millions of people around the world, that kind of negotiation is out of reach. They are trapped in jobs where saying no isn't even an option. And that will be the topic of today's episode, forced labor. We will look at what it really is, why it is so hard to eliminate, and how unions and legal tools are helping to fight it back. Joining me today is Jeroen Bernat, Political Director at the ITUC, who's worked on this issue for many years. Jeroen, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you, Stefania. Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, can you please introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about your background and your work at the ITUC?
Sure, happily. I'm Jeroen Bernat, and I've been with the ITUC already for 18 years now. And today I work in the General Secretary's office as his political director, but I actually started off as a project coordinator focused specifically on forced labor more than 17 years ago.
Thank you. So let's dive right into it. When we hear the term forced labor, I think a lot of people out there, including me, immediately picture historical slavery or some extreme situations happening. But I think it takes so many modern forms. So can you walk us through what it actually constitutes forced labor nowadays and how has this definition changed and expanded over time?
Yes, and you're right. Many people confuse forced labor with slavery, but there's a major difference. So if you look at the legal definitions, starting with slavery, which was then after the 19th century confirmed in the 1926 Anti-Slavery Convention in the League of Nations, that was followed quite shortly by a forced labor convention at the ILO that was addressing some of the atrocities that happened in colonial administrations where forced labor was exacted from people overseas. But it also addressed forced military recruitment and forced prison labor, and many of those things were state-enforced forced labor. But in the decades that followed 1930, it's become ever more clear with globalization and privatization that that level of exploitation and the fact that workers were exploited in a situation that they could not leave from involuntarily, that those forms of exploitation started happening increasingly in the private sector as well. And I think we see it around us today almost everywhere. And it goes from the global supply chains of your phone, of the food you eat, of the clothes you wear, to agriculture across the world, food production across the world, hospitality sectors. And one of the elements that became increasingly important is the abuse of the vulnerability of migrant workers and their precarious residence status. The fact that those migrants were often dependent on employment and sometimes even their employer for their residence status and their right to remain in a certain country, that became increasingly abused as a means of coercion to exploit migrant workers. And that basically led to a quite recent complement to the Forced Labor Convention in 2014, where in the International Labour Organization, the explicit link was made to the phenomenon of trafficking in persons that initially targeted specifically things like criminal gangs and prostitution, to also apply to trafficking for forced labor, abusing migrant workers upon destination. So that protocol in 2014 established that reality legally and also allowed for governments to establish legal and administrative frameworks to combat those more contemporary forms of exploitation.
It makes me realize how real it is and how much in touch we are, all of us, with it every day, from what we consume to the services that we use. Moreover, while preparing the episode, I found out that over 27 million people around the world are still currently affected by forced labor. 27 million. That is a staggering number. And yet this is a fundamental right, clearly recognized under international law, what you just mentioned before. So then, Jeroen, why is the right to freedom from forced labor still so difficult to guarantee, particularly for the most vulnerable groups?
Yeah, indeed. There are more people in forced labor today than there ever been at any point in human history. And the latest global estimate, the number that you mentioned, 27 million, that is actually up 10 million from the previous global estimate, which was done in 2016. And that is an extremely sharp rise, and that should worry us all, I think. And it's not accidental. To us in the global trade union movement, it's clear that it is a consequence of an economic system that is literally spiraling out of control. Forced labor doesn't happen in isolation. It's an extreme of labor exploitation. And we always say it's the exact opposite of what we call decent work. Those workers who are in forced labor, they also face discrimination. They're often underpaid. They accumulate debts because they don't earn enough money to repay them. They work in very unsafe working conditions. They are imposed excessive working hours. And it's so difficult, in that response to your question, it's so difficult to guarantee the right because it takes place in the blind spots of the economy. It always takes place where labor law is not enforced. It is in the informal economy, in remote, rural, agricultural areas where labor administration is absent. In conflict zones, that's where you encounter most forced labor. And the frank truth is that governments, rather than continue to allow the informal economy to flourish and break down labor protection and weaken labor inspection, because they seem to be competing to attract foreign investment. And it's all in the name of competitiveness. And that approach is very short-sighted, to be honest. And it does not only violate the human and labor rights of those workers, it also undermines a resilient and demand-driven economy and a stable society. It generates instability and conflict if people are exploited. But unfortunately, this logic, this neoliberal logic, is still dominant, and that really, really needs to be reversed.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, it's not only about how governments act, but also holding companies accountable.
The workers united will never be defeated! The workers united will never be defeated!
I have seen, though, that some countries and trading groups like the European Union, the US, France, and Japan are starting to pass laws that require businesses to take more responsibility for what happens in their supply chain. And I've also come across a few cases where companies have finally been challenged over the exploitation linked to their operations. This seems to be examples of due diligence law and strategic litigation in action, tools that aim to hold these companies accountable. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how are these tools being used in practice to protect workers?
Yes, of course. And due diligence and strategic litigation are relatively technical terms, but they're also key tools for us in the fight against forced labor. Due diligence is basically a concept that requires companies to check throughout their entire supply chain, so not only the people they directly employ, but also their contractors and suppliers, and to actually do something, to take real action to prevent exploitation and to address any risks of exploitation in their supply chain. And strategic litigation basically means selecting cases to take to court, not only to win actual compensation for those workers, but also to change how the law and the legal system sees forced labor and exposes the companies backing it. And we've seen a couple of important cases in recent years. One case where you could see the importance of strategic litigation to establish due diligence for forced labor is the Lafarge case in France, where the company was found criminally liable for financing armed groups in Syria to control workers and abuse it as a means of coercion. Why that is important is because it's one of the first cases that show that corporations can actually be held accountable legally for contributing to forced labor in conflict zones beyond their direct first tier of suppliers in another country. And that is really important because it's a major battle for the trade union movement to establish. Another case is the one of Indonesian fishermen against a specific company called Bumblebee Foods under the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And these men were recruited by agents and ended up on tuna boats supplying Bumblebee, where they endured brutal conditions. And then I'm speaking about beatings, severe injuries, withheld pay, threats if they stopped working. One of them was hit with a metal hook, so they felt completely trapped and voiceless. Their pay was withheld, and they were threatened with fines if they would refuse to continue to work. So it's, again, an extreme case of exploitation. And in their lawsuit, they demanded compensation, but also systemic reforms like rest periods, medical care, Wi-Fi access on board, and an end to transshipment at sea. And transshipment at sea is a practice where fishing boats transfer their catch to larger vessels far out on the ocean so that they can stay at sea for months without returning to a port. And that makes it nearly impossible for authorities to inspect conditions or intervene. It allows the abuse to continue unchecked, and it prevents the workers from leaving the vessel. And while the case is still ongoing, it stands as a powerful example of workers forcing a major company to answer for what's happening in its supply chain.
Yeah, it is devastating to hear all of these cases and how people's lives are put at risk. It really shows how far exploitation can go when no one is watching. But as you said, these legal tools, they are very important. However, forced labor is a big issue, and I think these tools aren't often enough, I believe. So please correct me if I'm wrong. I would like to know now what are the roles of unions in this situation, and how does the union action looks like in practice when it comes to forced labor? And also, if you have some examples, it would be nice to hear how workers in the unions have achieved a real difference.
Yeah, thank you, Stefania. And I couldn't agree more. Legal tools are indeed important, but they're not enough on their own. And without unions organizing on the ground, these tools rarely translate into real change. So unions do play a vital role, not only in exposing abuse, but also in pushing governments and employers to act. And I'm going to name just two cases. The first one is a case of Uzbekistan, where for decades the government ran one of the largest state-imposed systems of forced labor. It inherited from the Soviet era, where over 1 million students, teachers, and other civil servants were sent to pick cotton each year. They received no pay, and the conditions were very difficult. But thanks to years of sustained pressure from the local Uzbek trade unions and international unions in partnership with several international NGOs, and using the supervisory system of the International Labour Organization, the government ultimately dismantled the quota system. As recent as in 2022, the ILO could confirm that the cotton harvest was free of systemic child and forced labor. And that kind of transformation doesn't happen without workers. And another example is a bit older. It took place in the UK in 2004, where 23 undocumented Chinese cockle pickers tragically died. And it exposed just how badly unregulated labor providers were exploiting people and not taking care of workers. Unions like the TUC, the National Trade Union Centre in the UK, and Unite mobilized and pushed for change, and their efforts ultimately led to the Gangmasters Licensing Act, and that was to monitor and control these agencies to make sure they don't violate workers' rights.
Those stories are really powerful, and they show the extent of the workers' power when they organize. What I wonder now is, do you think, as the expert, are we entering a new legal era of accountability for forced labor, or do you think there are still major gaps that need to be addressed with this issue?
Yeah, well, you can call me a pessimist, but I wouldn't say we're entering into a new era of accountability, or at least not yet. The legal definitions across the world of forced labor and how they're interpreted legally is far too narrow, which makes identification and proof of a case of forced labor extremely difficult. And to be honest, in practice, apart from the strategic value of setting legal precedents, it's only the tip of the iceberg, as we say. True accountability for forced labor will only come with a deeper cultural shift, one that ends the impunity for all forms of workers' abuse. That means formally recognizing employment relationships wherever they exist, extending protections to all workers, regardless of their status, and ensuring proper enforcement across the economy. Only then we can prevent exploitation from escalating into forced labor.
That's an important reality check. But on the contrary of you, I am an optimist. So I strongly believe that there is hope. It feels like we are building the foundations for it through the work of the unions and the people bringing out the cases and the legal challenges and the growing pressure for change. What do you think our listeners should take away from today? Whether they're workers, consumers, employers, how can they help to put an end to forced labor?
Yeah, you're right. Optimism is a human obligation. But anyone listening should now understand that forced labor can occur anywhere at all time across the world. Do you actually know who's cooking your food in your favorite fast food restaurant? Do you know who's cleaning your room in the hotel when you're traveling? We should all, and we can all, be attentive of signals of exploitation. And that's what we call indicators of forced labor. Sometimes you know of identity documents that are withheld by employers, or people that face unpaid wages or facing excessive working hours. Whenever you see, read, or hear of those signs, the risk of forced labor is high. So we can all do something. Businesses can put pressure on suppliers. Workers and unions can reach out to the most vulnerable and organize. Consumers can ask more questions, can ask more information, and stop buying products tainted by forced labor, while governments definitely should strengthen labor protection and administration measures.
That's such a powerful message to end on. Forced labor isn't just a distant issue, as we have learned. It is something that can exist much closer than we think in the products we buy, the services we use, everything. And we all have a role to play in ending it, whether that means speaking out, making more informed choices, or organizing in our workplaces. Every action helps push things in the right direction. Jeroen, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, in our next episode, we will be looking at another fundamental right, the right to be free from discrimination. What does workplace discrimination actually look like today? Who does it affect? And how are workers and unions creating fairer, more inclusive workplaces? We will be exploring all of that and more in the next installment of Back to Basics. Until then, if this episode gave you something to think about, please like it, share it, and subscribe to our channel to stay connected for more insights on how we can shape a just and equitable future through collective action. See you next time.